Arthur had always thought he knew his property like the back of his hand. 60 years of life, 23 of them living on that isolated ranch in Montana. And he figured there weren't any more secrets hidden among those century-old trees. How wrong he was. Before we dive deeper, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of tea or just some water, and sit back as we begin this journey together. Arthur Sullivan, known to everyone as Arthur, was a retired rancher, widowed for 4 years. And until a few weeks ago, his biggest concern was deciding whether to plant corn or soybeans next season. His routine was predictable. Breakfast at 6, check the cattle, fix whatever needed fixing, and at the end of the day, a walk through the woods behind the house to clear his mind. It was during one of those walks that his life changed forever. The story began on an October afternoon, when the leaves had already turned that golden shade Arthur had always loved. Eleanor, his late wife, used to say that fall was when nature showed its true colors before the great rest of winter. That day, he felt a strange restlessness, as if something was calling him to go deeper into the woods than he normally went. Usually Arthur would follow the main trail for about a mile, reach the clearing where he and Eleanor used to picnic and head back. But that afternoon, something urged him to keep going. It was like a silent voice whispering that he needed to go beyond the familiar, explore the part of the forest he rarely visited. The property covered over 500 acres, and the forested portion stretched across at least 125 of them. Arthur knew the main trails, of course, but there were hidden corners he hadn't seen in years. He decided to follow a secondary path that wound uphill through pine trees so tall you could barely see the sky through their canopy. As he walked, he noticed something peculiar. The normal sounds of the forest, birds singing, squirrels racing through branches, the rustling of dry leaves, gradually faded until the silence became almost deafening. It wasn't the natural quiet you sometimes find in nature. This was something different, as if all life around had paused to pay attention to something. That's when Arthur saw the light. At first, he thought it was just sunlight filtering through the trees in an unusual way, creating those golden beams that sometimes cut through the woods after rain. But the closer he got, the more obvious it became that this light wasn't coming from above. It was emanating from somewhere on the forest floor about 150 feet ahead. His first thought was completely rational. Someone was camping on his property, probably college kids who had gotten lost and built a campfire to keep warm. Arthur had encountered trespassers a few times over the years, mostly just folks who were lost and needed directions back to the main road. But as he approached, he realized the light was too strange to be a campfire. It was too steady, too white, almost bluish, and there was no smell of smoke in the air. In that moment, he had no idea he was about to discover something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about reality, to fully understand why that encounter in the forest had such an impact on Arthur. You need to know the emotional state he was in during those days. On the surface, he looked like a man who had achieved a peaceful retirement, property paid off, some savings in the bank, reasonably good health for his 60 years. But inside, Arthur was going through one of the most difficult phases of his life. Eleanor's death 4 years earlier had left a void he still didn't know how to fill. It wasn't just the grief. He had expected that, and in a way had learned to live with it. What really troubled him was a growing sense that his life had completely lost its purpose. During their 36 years of marriage, every decision, every plan, every dream had revolved around Eleanor. Now, for the first time since he was 22, he found himself completely alone in deciding what to do with whatever time he had left. Mornings were the worst. Arthur would wake up at 6 a.m., out of pure habit, but often stayed in bed for another hour, staring at the ceiling and wondering what the point was of getting up. The cattle needed checking, the fences needed maintenance, the house needed small repairs, but all of it felt mechanical, devoid of real meaning. Even worse was the feeling that he was wasting something precious. Arthur had a comfortable retirement, enough health to travel if he wanted, freedom to do anything he desired, but he couldn't figure out what he actually desired. Eleanor had always been the dreamer in the family, the one who planned trips, suggested new hobbies, organized visits with the kids. Without her, Arthur realized he had become a reactive person, someone who responded to other people's plans and dreams, but who had long ago stopped dreaming on his own. The kids, Michael and Sarah, called regularly and visited when they could, but both had their own families and careers in other cities. Arthur didn't want to be a burden to them, so he always said he was fine, that he was keeping busy. But the truth was that the days dragged by with torturous slowness. He had tried a few things. He even signed up for a local church group for widowers, but the meetings left him more depressed than before. He tried getting interested in fishing, something he had always promised to do when he had more time, but discovered that sitting by a lake with his own thoughts was the last thing he needed. Even more troubling was a strange feeling that had been growing over recent months, the sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the world around him. Arthur had never been much of a news person, but lately he couldn't shake the impression that everything was getting darker, more complicated, more hopeless. When he turned on the TV, he saw nothing but bad news. International conflicts, economic crises, political polarization, natural disasters. When he talked to neighbors, he heard mostly complaints about the government, about prices, about young people, about how everything was worse than before. When he went to town to shop, he noticed people looking grumpy, rushed, irritated by things that seemed trivial. Arthur began wondering if it had always been this way, and he simply hadn't paid attention when he was focused on his life with Eleanor, or if there really was some change in the air. There were days when he felt like he was living in a world that was gradually losing its color, becoming a grayer, more hopeless version of itself. The daily walk in the forest had become his only real refuge. There, away from the news, away from worries about the future, away from the loneliness of the empty house, Arthur could find a few moments of peace. Nature didn't lie, didn't dramatize, didn't try to sell fear or anger. Trees simply grew, birds simply sang, seasons simply changed at their own natural pace. That's why on that October afternoon when he felt that strange restlessness, that call to go deeper into the forest, Arthur didn't hesitate. Anything that could break the monotonous, meaningless routine his life had become was welcome. He wasn't looking for adventure. He wasn't that type of person. But he was definitely looking for something that would make him feel alive again. If he had known he was about to find answers to questions he didn't even know he had, maybe he would have hesitated. But in that moment, all Arthur wanted was to escape, even temporarily, from the crushing weight of a life that seemed to have completely lost its way. The real surprise was still to come, and would forever change his perspective, not just on his own existence, but on the fundamental nature of human reality. Arthur approached the light source with the natural caution of someone who had lived his entire life in the countryside. Decades of dealing with cattle, wildlife, and occasional property trespassers had taught him never to approach something unknown without first observing and assessing the situation. He stopped about 60 feet away, hidden behind a particularly wide oak tree, and tried to understand what he was seeing. The light definitely wasn't natural, but it also didn't look like any equipment Arthur knew. It was a soft, steady luminosity that seemed to emanate from a circular area on the forest floor, as if someone had installed some kind of underground spotlight. But there were no cables, no generators, absolutely no mechanical noise that would normally accompany electrical equipment. His first theory was that some geological research company was doing surveys in the area. Arthur knew that sometimes mining or oil companies did this type of work, installing temporary equipment to map the underground. Maybe it was some kind of special scanner he had never seen before. Technology changed so rapidly that it wouldn't be surprising if there were new equipment he was completely unfamiliar with. But then he remembered he owned the land. Any company wanting to do research there would have to ask permission first or at least notify him, and he hadn't received any contact like that. Besides, how would they have brought equipment up there? The trail he had followed was too narrow for vehicles, and there were no tire tracks or signs that anything heavy had been dragged through the woods. Maybe it was university research, he thought. Sometimes students did field work on rural properties, studying soil, wildlife, or plant growth patterns. Universities had more sophisticated equipment these days, and maybe that light was part of some legitimate scientific study. But even so, they should have asked permission. Arthur watched for a few more minutes, waiting to see some movement, some sign of human activity. Researchers normally didn't leave equipment running unattended for long. There was always someone nearby monitoring, taking notes, collecting data. But the area around the light seemed completely deserted. That's when he noticed something even stranger. The vegetation around the light source seemed different. Not damaged, exactly, but better. Plants near the illuminated area had a more vibrant green, fuller leaves, as if they were receiving some kind of special nutrient. Some wild flowers that normally withered in early fall were still blooming with more intense colors than Arthur remembered ever seeing. This reinforced his scientific research theory. Maybe it was some kind of experiment with fertilizers or plant growth stimulants. Agricultural companies were always developing new ways to increase crop productivity. It made sense that they would test their products in natural environments before commercializing them. But still, why hadn't they contacted him? And how exactly did that thing work? Arthur had enough agricultural experience to know there was no fertilizer that created this kind of immediate visual effect, especially not something that generated its own light. He decided the best approach would be to identify himself. If they were legitimate researchers, they would explain what they were doing and probably apologize for not asking permission beforehand. If they were trespassers or vandals, his presence would be enough to make them leave. Either way, he had the right to know what was happening on his own property. Arthur stepped out from behind the tree and took a few steps toward the light, stopping again when he was about 30 feet away. He cleared his throat loudly, the sound echoing through the silent forest. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding louder than intended in the absolute silence. "Is anyone there?" No response. The light continued emanating from the same spot, steady and undisturbed. "I'm the owner of this land," he tried again, this time with a firmer tone. "If you're doing some kind of research here, we need to talk about permission." Still, nothing. But Arthur had the strange impression that something was moving in the illuminated area, something he couldn't clearly distinguish due to the light's brightness. It wasn't human movement. It was more subtle, as if the light itself was somehow reorganizing. This made him reconsider his theories. Maybe it wasn't research equipment after all. Maybe it was some kind of modern art installation. Arthur had read about artists who created installations in remote locations using light and technology to create immersive experiences. There was even a name for it, land art or something like that. Maybe some artist had chosen his property for a temporary installation. But even this explanation didn't completely satisfy him. Artists would also ask permission, especially for something so elaborate. And how would they have gotten electrical power to that location? Arthur's property was over 2 miles from the nearest power grid. Maybe it was battery or solar powered. Battery equipment was getting more powerful every year. And maybe there were batteries capable of powering that type of light for extended periods. As for solar power, it would be possible if there were panels hidden somewhere nearby, although Arthur couldn't see any. But what happened next defied any rational explanation Arthur could imagine. The light began to pulse, not irregularly or randomly, but with a specific rhythm, almost as if it were responding to his presence. It was a hypnotic pattern. 3 quick pulses followed by a pause, then 2 longer pulses, another pause, and then a single sustained pulse. Arthur knew Morse code from his time briefly serving in the National Guard decades ago, but this definitely wasn't Morse. It was something different, more complex, almost as if it had a musical quality. His rational mind immediately searched for explanations. Motion sensors. That had to be it. The equipment, whatever it was programmed to respond to human presence. Modern security systems did this kind of thing all the time. They detected movement and activated lights, cameras, or alarms. Maybe this was some kind of sophisticated security system designed to scare off intruders. But why would someone install such an elaborate security system in a forest in the middle of nowhere? And why did the light pattern seem so intelligent? It wasn't just a simple automatic response. There was something almost communicative about those pulses. Arthur took a few more steps toward the light, fascinated despite his growing skepticism. As he approached, the pulse pattern changed, becoming faster and more complex. It was as if the system was adjusting its response based on his proximity. When he was just 15 feet from the light source, something extraordinary happened. The pulses stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the light intensified so much that Arthur had to shield his eyes with his hand. When the intensity decreased again, he lowered his hand and saw something that made his heart race. There was a form in the light. Not exactly solid, not exactly transparent, but definitely present. It was vaguely humanoid, but with slightly different proportions, taller, thinner, with contours that seemed to flow and constantly reorganize themselves. Arthur's mind went into panic mode. Holography. It had to be holography. He had seen hologram demonstrations on TV, three-dimensional projections that looked real but were just optical illusions created by lasers and mirrors. Technology was advancing rapidly, and maybe it was already possible to create holograms so realistic they could fool someone at close distance. But who would install such a sophisticated hologram in an isolated forest? And why? Maybe it was some kind of military test. Arthur knew the army sometimes used rural properties to test new equipment. Maybe this was some kind of experimental holographic camouflage system. Or maybe it was an elaborate prank. Maybe his kids had hired someone to create some kind of special entertainment, a creative way to pull him out of his depression. Michael worked in tech. It was possible he had contacts who could create something like this. But even as his rational mind offered these explanations, a deeper part of Arthur knew there was something fundamentally different about this. The form in the light didn't move like a hologram. There was weight to it, presence, a quality of consciousness that no projection could replicate. And then, to his complete bewilderment, the form began to speak, not with audible words, but directly into his mind. Arthur heard a clear, gentle voice that seemed to come from within his own thoughts. "Don't be afraid, Arthur. I've been waiting for you." What he saw next defied all his reality and would force him to question everything he thought he knew about the world. Arthur's first instinct was to take a step back. But his legs seemed to have forgotten how to work. The voice in his mind had been so clear, so distinct, that for a moment he wondered if he wasn't having some kind of medical episode. Maybe a minor stroke or a side effect from some medication. He had been taking blood pressure medication for a few years. Could it possibly be causing hallucinations? "You're not having hallucinations, Arthur," the voice continued as if it could read his thoughts. "And there's nothing wrong with your mental health. I know this is difficult to process, but I ask that you give me a few moments to explain." Arthur tried to find his voice, but all that came out was a hoarse, inarticulate sound. His mind was racing, desperately searching for rational explanations. Maybe it was some kind of direct brain transmission technology. He had read about experiments with neural implants that allowed direct communication with computers. Maybe there was more advanced technology that could transmit messages to the human mind without implants. But how would someone know his name, and how could the voice respond to his thoughts in real time? "My name is Zion," the form in the light continued. "I come from very far away, from a place your scientists haven't discovered yet. I'm here because your species is approaching a crucial moment in its evolution. And people like you, people who are open, questioning, who sense that something is wrong with the world, are essential to what's coming." Arthur finally managed to recover his voice, though it trembled visibly. This can't be happening. This isn't real." "I understand your disbelief," Zion responded, his mental voice maintaining a patient and understanding tone. "Your mind is trying to fit this experience into familiar categories. It's a natural defense mechanism. But let me show you some things that might help you expand your understanding of what's possible." The form in the light extended what appeared to be an arm toward a nearby tree. Arthur watched incredulous as the tree, a young oak with leaves already yellowed by fall, began to change before his eyes. The yellow leaves gradually regained their vibrant green color, as if they were being fed by some invisible energy. Branches that had looked dry and brittle became flexible and full of life again. "Magic trick," Arthur muttered to himself, though his voice carried no conviction. "Some kind of chemical in the air, or special lights that make things look different." But even as he spoke, Arthur knew that didn't explain what he was seeing. The tree's transformation was real. He could smell the fresh sap, hear the slight creaking of branches becoming more flexible, and there was no visible equipment that could cause this effect. "Keen observation," Zion commented, and Arthur detected a note of approval in the mental voice. "You're naturally skeptical, which is a valuable quality, but let me show you something that will be harder to explain through conventional technology." The form in the light made a broad gesture, and Arthur felt a strange sensation, as if the air around him was becoming denser, more charged with energy. Suddenly, small lights began appearing throughout the forest. Not artificial lights, but a soft luminosity that seemed to emanate from the plants themselves. Every leaf, every branch, every wild flower began to glow with its own inner light. Arthur blinked several times, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the phenomenon persisted. The entire forest had transformed into a fairy tale landscape, with every element of nature emanating a soft golden luminosity. Bioluminescence, he whispered, clinging to the first scientific explanation that came to mind. Some kind of fungus or bacteria that causes bioluminescence. You must have released spores in the air. An interesting theory, Zion responded. But how would that explain this? Arthur looked at his own hands and almost screamed in shock. They were glowing too, not just his hands. He could see a soft aura of light emanating from his entire body, visible through his clothes. It was as if he had become part of the forest's luminous display. "This isn't possible," he said, his voice now clearly panicked. "Human beings don't. We don't glow. That doesn't exist." "But you're seeing it," Zion responded gently. "And more than that, you're feeling it. Pay attention to how you feel right now, Arthur. How long has it been since you felt so alive?" Arthur paused to process the question and realized with surprise that Zion was right. Despite the fear and confusion, he felt extraordinarily good. The chronic fatigue he had been carrying for months had disappeared. His joints, which normally ached a little after long walks, felt flexible and pain-free. There was an energy running through his body that he hadn't felt in years. "What did you do to me?" he asked, touching his own chest as if he could physically feel the light emanating from him. "I did nothing," Zion explained. "I simply temporarily removed some of the interference that normally blocks your species' natural perception. The light you see was always there. The energy you feel was always yours. Your civilization simply forgot how to perceive them." Arthur shook his head vigorously. "No, this is impossible. It would require rewriting all of physics, all of biology. If humans really glowed, if we had this energy, science would have discovered it long ago." "Your science has discovered many wonderful things," Zion agreed, "but it was also directed to focus only on specific aspects of reality. There are forces, energies, and capabilities that your species naturally possesses, but which have been discouraged over time." "Discouraged by whom?" Arthur asked, and then immediately regretted the question. He was starting to sound as if he believed the conversation, which certainly wasn't the case. Or was it? "That's a complex question that requires a complex answer," Zion said, "and I promise we'll get to it. But first, let me show you one more thing that might help you understand the magnitude of what's being hidden from your species." The form in the light made another gesture, and Arthur felt a strange sensation, as if his perceptions were being amplified. Suddenly, he could hear things he hadn't heard before. Not just physical sounds, but something more subtle. It was as if each plant, each tree, each small insect was emitting a kind of music. Not music in the conventional sense, but harmonic patterns of energy that combined into a complex and beautiful natural symphony. And then he realized he could feel the emotions of the plants around him. The large oak behind him radiated a sense of ancient wisdom and patience. The wild flowers nearby pulsed with simple, pure joy. Even the grass under his feet transmitted a kind of quiet contentment. "This is madness," Arthur whispered, but his voice no longer held its previous conviction. "Plants don't have emotions. They don't have consciousness, don't they?" Zion asked softly. "Or is that simply what you were taught to believe? Is your own experience right now telling you something different?" Arthur couldn't argue against his own perception. He was clearly feeling some kind of emotional communication coming from the plants around him. It was impossible, scientifically speaking, but it was unquestionably real to him in that moment. How was all he could manage to ask? "Because you, like all members of your species, possess capabilities that go far beyond what you've been told is possible," Zion explained. "You are multi-dimensional beings capable of perceiving and interacting with aspects of reality that your current science doesn't even recognize. But these capabilities have been systematically suppressed, discouraged, and ridiculed for generations." "Why?" Arthur asked. And this time, he didn't try to hide the fact that he was genuinely curious about the answer. "Because people who know their true power are much harder to control," Zion replied. and there was a note of sadness in his mental voice. And there are forces in your world that benefit greatly from keeping your species in ignorance about their own capabilities. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine, not from fear, but from a deep and disturbing recognition. On some level, he couldn't rationally explain. This made sense. It explained the growing feeling he had been having that something was fundamentally wrong with the world, that people were living far below their real potential. But the true revelation that would change everything was still to come and would force Arthur to confront truths about humanity that would shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew. Arthur's mind went into complete meltdown. As extraordinary as the experiences of the last few minutes had been, a fundamental part of his psyche refused to accept what was happening. It was as if 40 years of rational conditioning were screaming in unison that this was impossible, dangerous, and that he needed to escape immediately. "No," he said aloud, taking several steps backward. No. This isn't happening. I'm not having this conversation with whatever you are." The luminosity around the forest began to dim as Arthur moved away, as if his own disbelief was undoing the phenomenon. The plants gradually returned to their normal appearance, and the light emanating from his own body became fainter and fainter. "Arthur, please." Zion's voice sounded in his mind, but now seemed more distant, less clear. "I understand this is disturbing, but if you run now, you'll lose an opportunity that may never come again." "Opportunity?" Arthur nearly shouted, his voice echoing through the forest that had returned to normal silence. "Opportunity for what?" "To go crazy. To completely lose my mind." He turned and began walking quickly back down the trail, his heart beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. His rational mind had reassumed control and was offering a flood of alternative explanations for what he had just experienced. Stress. It had to be stress. Arthur knew he had been under significant emotional pressure in recent months. The loneliness, the depression, the sense of lack of purpose. All of this could cause hallucinations. He had read about it. People in severe stress states sometimes experienced very vivid visual and auditory hallucinations. Or maybe it was some medical condition he didn't know about. Brain tumors could cause hallucinations, as could certain vitamin deficiencies or chemical imbalances. He needed to schedule a medical appointment immediately, get complete tests, maybe an MRI. But as he walked quickly down the trail, trying to distance himself from the encounter site, Arthur couldn't escape certain disturbing inconsistencies in his rational explanations. If these were stress-induced hallucinations, why were they so coherent, so detailed, so interactive? Hallucinations were usually fragmented, confusing. What he had experienced had an internal logic, a consistency that was hard to explain. And there were physical details that didn't make sense if everything was a product of his imagination. He could smell something different in the air, an almost floral fragrance, but not exactly from any flower he knew. He could feel a slight vibration in the ground under his feet, as if some energy was pulsing through the earth. His hands still had a strange sensation, as if they had been touched by a very gentle electric current. "Imagination," he muttered to himself. "All imagination. The brain can create false physical sensations when it's under stress." But then he remembered the tree, the transformation he had witnessed. Yellowed leaves returning to vibrant green, dry branches becoming flexible again. Could his mind have imagined something so specific and detailed? Arthur stopped abruptly on the trail and turned to look back in the direction he had come from. He was too far away now to see the area where he had encountered Zion, but part of him wanted to go back just to check if the tree had really changed, or if it had all been an elaborate optical illusion. "No," he said to himself firmly, "I'm not going back. This is exactly how people end up in mental hospitals, chasing hallucinations, trying to prove impossible things are real." He continued walking, but his mind couldn't stop analyzing the experience. One particularly disturbing aspect was how good he had felt during the encounter. Not just physically, though the energy and absence of joint pain had been notable. There was something deeper, a sense of connection, of purpose, of being exactly where he should be. It was as if for a few minutes all the depression and confusion of recent months had simply evaporated. And that, Arthur realized, was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the entire experience. If his mind was creating elaborate hallucinations to escape the depressive reality of his life, that was a sign that his mental state was worse than he had imagined. This is exactly how people lost touch with reality, creating increasingly elaborate fantasies to escape real problems. When he finally got back to the house, Arthur was determined to approach the situation practically and rationally. He immediately called his doctor's office and scheduled an appointment for the next day, explaining that he had had some strange episodes of altered perception and wanted to get tested to rule out neurological problems. He spent the rest of the afternoon researching online about stress-related hallucinations, chemical imbalances in the brain, and medication side effects. He found dozens of cases of people who had experienced vivid hallucinations during periods of great emotional pressure. Many reported experiences that seemed completely real at the time, but which they later recognized as products of their overloaded minds. This temporarily reassured him. There was a rational explanation for everything, and he would take the necessary steps to solve the problem. But that night, as he tried to sleep, Arthur found himself constantly rethinking the details of the experience. Not just the fantastic aspects, the light, the plant transformation, the telepathic communication, but the specific words Zion had used. People like you, people who are open, questioning, who sense that something is fundamentally wrong with the world are essential to what's coming. That had hit something deep in Arthur. He really did feel that something was wrong with the world. The feeling had been growing for months, a persistent intuition that people were living far below their potential, that there were forces keeping humanity in a kind of artificial dormancy. But that feeling itself could be explained rationally. Arthur was depressed, isolated, consuming too much negative news. It was natural that he would develop a pessimistic view of the world. His mind, seeking escape, had created an elaborate fantasy where his dark intuitions about society were validated by a superior being who chose him as special. It was a classic pattern of megalomaniacal thinking, Arthur realized with horror. People with certain mental conditions frequently developed delusions where they were chosen for special missions or received important revelations. The more he thought about it, the more the psychiatric explanation made sense. The next morning, Arthur woke up determined to solve the problem definitively. He would take whatever medications the doctor prescribed, maybe see a psychologist, change his diet and exercise routine. He would do whatever was necessary to return to a healthy mental state. But as he was having coffee and preparing for his medical appointment, something strange happened. Arthur looked out the kitchen window toward the forest and saw clearly a soft light pulsing among the trees. It wasn't the same intense light he had seen the day before, but something more subtle, like a very slow and rhythmic blinking. He blinked several times and rubbed his eyes, certain it was just a reflection of the sun or some trick of morning light. But when he looked again, the pulsation was still there. Relapse, he muttered to himself. That's how these things work. The mind keeps creating the same hallucinatory patterns. But a deeper part of Arthur, a part he was desperately trying to ignore, whispered that maybe there was another explanation. Maybe he wasn't crazy. Maybe he really had encountered something extraordinary, and his flight had been motivated not by reason, but by fear of accepting a reality that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. This possibility was almost more terrifying than the alternative of having mental problems, because if Zion was real, if everything he had experienced was real, then everything Arthur believed about the nature of reality was fundamentally wrong, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face the implications of that. But what would happen in the next few hours would force Arthur to confront physical evidence so undeniable that there would be no more room for denial or conventional rational explanations. The medical appointment wasn't what Arthur expected. Dr. Reynolds, his doctor for over 15 years, performed a complete physical exam and was visibly perplexed by the results. Arthur's blood pressure, which normally required medication to stay at acceptable levels, was perfectly normal. His reflexes were sharper than they had been in years. Even some chronic joint problems in his knee and shoulder seemed to have improved significantly. Arthur, I don't know how to explain this, doctor, Reynolds said, reviewing the test results. Your vital signs are better than I've seen in years. Your resting heart rate has decreased. Your energy level seems to have increased. And you've even lost a few pounds. What have you been doing differently? Arthur hesitated. How could he explain that he believed an encounter with a possible alien had temporarily improved his health? Just changes in diet and more exercise. He lied. Well, keep doing whatever you're doing, the doctor said. As for the hallucinations you mentioned, considering your exceptional physical condition, I'd say they were more likely caused by temporary stress than any serious medical condition. But let's do some blood work to be sure. Arthur left the office more confused than when he arrived. If everything had been a stress-induced hallucination, how could he explain the dramatic improvement in his physical health? Hallucinations didn't cure real joint problems or normalize blood pressure. During the drive home, he found himself constantly looking toward the forest. The pulsing light he had seen that morning was no longer visible in daylight, but Arthur felt a magnetic attraction toward that area. It was as if something was gently calling him back. He tried to resist for several hours after getting home. He organized some tools in the barn, checked the pasture fence, even started reading a book that had been gathering dust for months. But nothing could get his mind off the forest and what had happened there. Around 5 inches the afternoon, he decided he would take a quick walk on the main trail just to prove to himself that there was nothing extraordinary there. He wouldn't go to the specific encounter site, just follow the familiar route to the clearing where he and Eleanor used to picnic. But when he reached the clearing, Arthur found something that made his heart race violently. In the center of the area, where there was normally just grass and a few scattered wildflowers, there now grew a perfect circle of plants he had never seen before. They weren't native Montana plants. They were something completely different, with leaves that seemed to have an almost crystalline texture, and flowers that emitted a very subtle luminosity even in daylight. Arthur approached slowly, his skepticism waging a fierce battle with the physical evidence before his eyes. The plants were indisputably real. He could touch them, feel their texture, breathe in their sweet, exotic fragrance. There was no rational explanation for how completely unknown plants could have grown overnight in an area he knew intimately. Even more disturbing, the plants seemed to be arranged in a specific pattern. It wasn't random growth. There was a deliberate, almost mathematical symmetry to how they were organized. It was as if someone had planted a cosmic garden during the night. "This is impossible," Arthur muttered, crouching down to examine the plants more closely. Plants don't grow like this, not overnight. But as he watched, he noticed something even stranger. The plants seemed to be reacting to his presence. When he extended his hand toward one of them, its leaves tilted subtly in his direction, like sunflowers following the sun. When he moved to a different position, the plants reoriented themselves to continue looking at him. Arthur pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. "Plants don't do this," he said to himself, but his voice was shaking. "Plants don't. They're not conscious." That's when he heard the familiar voice in his mind. "They always have been conscious, Arthur. You simply never had your senses open to perceive it." Arthur turned quickly and saw Zion emerging from among the trees around the clearing. This time, the form was more solid, more clearly defined. There was still an ethereal quality about it, but Arthur could distinguish specific features. A humanoid structure, but taller and thinner than a typical human, with eyes that seemed to contain infinite depths. "You came back," Zion said, and there was a note of gentle satisfaction in his mental voice. "I didn't want to come back," Arthur replied, but even as he spoke, he knew he was lying. Part of him had been longing for this moment all day. I needed to see if the physical evidence would still be here," Zion completed. "It's understandable. Your mind needs tangible proof to accept what your deeper senses already know to be true." Arthur gestured toward the circle of exotic plants. How? How is this possible? Plants don't grow overnight. This species doesn't even exist in Montana. It doesn't exist in your normal Montana dimension," Zion corrected gently. "But there are many layers of reality overlapping in what you consider to be simple space. These plants were always here, growing at a slightly different frequency than you normally perceive. I simply adjusted the frequency so they could be seen in your dimension." Arthur shook his head violently. "That doesn't make sense. Different frequencies, overlapping dimensions. That sounds like science fiction." "Your own science is beginning to discover similar concepts," Zion observed. "Quantum physics, string theory, multiverses. Your most advanced scientists already suspect that reality is much more complex and multi-layered than you imagined." Arthur couldn't argue with that. He had read articles about quantum physics that were equally hard to accept. Particles that existed in multiple states simultaneously, realities that changed based on observation, instantaneous connections across impossible distances. But even if that were true, Arthur said, why show me? Why now? Why me? Zion approached slowly, and Arthur noticed that wherever he stepped, small flowers began sprouting instantly from the ground. Because your species is approaching a critical tipping point in its evolution, there are forces working to keep you at a very low frequency of consciousness, drastically limiting your potential. But there are also people like you, people who intuitively sense something is wrong, who are beginning to awaken to greater possibilities. What kind of forces? Arthur asked, and realized he had stopped questioning the basic reality of the situation. Maybe it was mental exhaustion, or maybe the physical evidence was simply too undeniable. That's a complex answer, Zion said. But before we get to it, let me show you something that will help you understand the magnitude of what's at stake. Zion raised a hand, and Arthur felt a shift in the energy around them. Suddenly, he could see lines of light connecting all the plants in the clearing, forming a complex network of energy that pulsed with its own life. And it wasn't just the plants. He could see similar lines connecting him to Zion, to the trees around them, even extending beyond the forest in directions he couldn't completely track. This is the true nature of reality, Zion explained. Everything is connected in a network of consciousness and energy. You, as a species, once knew how to perceive and interact with this network. This is how your ancestors communicated with nature, healed each other, and manifested abundance in their lives. Arthur watched, fascinated, as one of the energy lines extending from him began to pulse more intensely. He followed it with his eyes and saw that it connected to a damaged tree at the edge of the clearing. An old apple tree that had been struck by lightning years before and never fully recovered. Try sending healing energy to it, Zion encouraged. Simply have the intention, and the network will do the rest. Arthur felt ridiculous, but he had come too far to back down now. He focused on the damaged tree and tried, not quite knowing how, to send positive energy toward it through the line of light that connected them. To his complete disbelief, the tree responded immediately. Branches that had been dry and broken for years began to show signs of new life. Small green shoots began appearing along the charred trunk. Within minutes, the tree had begun a transformation that should have taken months or years. "This is impossible," Arthur whispered, but his voice no longer carried denial, only stunned admiration. "For your current understanding of reality, yes," Zion agreed, "but for the broader understanding your species once possessed, this would be as natural as breathing." Arthur looked at his own hands, still barely believing what he had just done. If this is real, if we really have these abilities, why don't we know about them? Why hasn't our science discovered this? Because there are very powerful forces that benefit from keeping your species ignorant about its true potential, Zion replied, and his mental voice carried a dark note. And it's time for you to learn about them. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. He knew instinctively that he was about to hear something that would forever change his understanding, not just of himself, but of the very nature of human society. Zion gestured for Arthur to sit on a moss-covered rock near the center of the clearing. The energy around them seemed to intensify, and Arthur could sense he was about to hear something deeply significant. "Arthur, what I'm about to share with you may be disturbing," Zion began, his mental voice carrying solemn weight. "But you need to understand this isn't a casual conversation. You were called here because your species is at a critical crossroads, and people like you, people who can sense something is fundamentally wrong, are essential to what needs to happen." Arthur sat heavily on the rock, his mind still trying to process everything he had witnessed. "What exactly is wrong, and why should I believe anything you're telling me?" "You should believe because on some deep level, you already know it's true," Zion replied. "In recent months, you've felt growing dissatisfaction with the world around you, not just sadness over losing your wife, but something more fundamental, a sense that people are living far below their potential, that there's a dark energy keeping all of humanity in a kind of dormancy." Arthur felt a chill of recognition. That was exactly how he had been feeling, but he had never been able to articulate it so clearly. That feeling isn't accidental, Zion continued. Your species is being systematically kept at a low vibrational frequency through very specific and deliberate methods. And you, like many others, are beginning to awaken from that programming. Programming? Arthur asked, though part of him was already starting to understand what Zion meant. Observe your society objectively, Zion said, and with a gesture created a kind of energy window in the air between them. Through it, Arthur could see images that seemed to come from his own memory. News broadcasts, advertisements, social media, all passing in rapid sequence. What you call media is constantly feeding your minds with fear, anger, scarcity, and division, Zion explained, as the images succeeded one another. Wars, economic crises, natural disasters, political conflicts, diseases. Day after day, year after year, your minds are bombarded with low-vibration energy. Arthur watched the images and realized he rarely saw positive news on television. When he turned on the news, it was always about some conflict, some tragedy, some impending crisis. But that's just realism, Arthur argued. The world really does have problems. The media is just reporting what happens. It's reporting a very selective version of what happens, Zion corrected. For every tragedy that's amplified and repeated endlessly, there are thousands of acts of kindness, positive innovations, and human achievements that are completely ignored or minimized. The ratio between negative and positive content in your media doesn't reflect reality. It reflects a specific agenda. The images in the energy window changed, now showing scenes Arthur rarely saw on the news. People helping each other, beneficial scientific advances, thriving communities, acts of human compassion and creativity. This agenda exists because people in states of fear, anger, and worry are much easier to control, Zion explained. When you're focused on survival and external problems, you don't have mental or emotional energy to question systems, develop your inner capabilities, or pursue your true potential. Arthur felt instinctive resistance to this idea. Are you suggesting there's some kind of conspiracy that someone is deliberately keeping people depressed and afraid? Not a conspiracy in the sense you normally imagine, Zion said patiently. Not a group of people meeting in secret rooms to plan world domination. It's more subtle and systemic than that. The energy window now showed images of different systems, corporations, governments, religious institutions, educational systems, pharmaceutical industry, financial system. Think of it this way, Zion continued. What system benefits when people feel inadequate about their bodies? The cosmetics, diet, and plastic surgery industry. What system benefits when people feel sick and dependent? The pharmaceutical industry. What system benefits when people feel financially insecure? Banks and credit companies. What system benefits when people feel divided and in conflict? Politicians who promise to protect them from enemies. Arthur began to see the pattern. So, you're saying these systems have an interest in keeping people in a state of lack and fear? Exactly. And over decades, these systems have become so interconnected and self-reinforcing that even the people operating them don't fully perceive the collective effect, Zion explained. They simply follow incentives that naturally result in keeping the population at a low frequency of consciousness. But what about people trying to make change? Activists, reformers, people who want a better world, Arthur asked. Observe how they're treated, Zion replied. And the images changed again. They're ridiculed, marginalized, or channeled into forms of activism that don't really threaten the fundamental system. They're kept focused on symptoms instead of root causes. Arthur saw images of protests portrayed negatively in media, movements that started with high ideals but were gradually corrupted or divided, visionary leaders who were discredited or distracted. More importantly, Zion continued, people who begin awakening to their true capabilities, like you're doing now, are discouraged through scientific ridicule, social pressure, or even programmed self-doubt. Programmed self-doubt? Arthur asked. How many times have you had a strong intuition about something, but dismissed it because it wasn't logical, or because other people might think you were strange? Zion asked. How many times have you felt a special connection with nature, with other people, or had experiences you couldn't explain scientifically, but suppressed them because they didn't fit what you were taught was real? Arthur felt deep and uncomfortable recognition. There had been many moments in his life when he had felt things he couldn't explain. Premonitions that proved correct. Moments of deep connection with Eleanor that seemed to transcend normal communication. Instants in nature when he felt part of something much larger. But he had always dismissed these experiences as imagination or coincidence. You're taught from childhood that if something can't be measured, weighed, and quantified, it's not real. Zion explained that intuition is superstition, that energetic connections are fantasy, that natural healing abilities are placebo. This programming is so deep that you police each other to maintain it. But science has brought many benefits, Arthur argued. Modern medicine, technology, communication. Absolutely, Zion agreed. Your science has discovered many important truths, but it was also deliberately limited to focus only on materialistic aspects of reality. Entire fields of research that could reveal the capabilities I'm showing you were defunded, ridiculed, or directed into dead ends. The energy window now showed scientific research, studies on consciousness, subtle energy, extraordinary human capabilities. Alternative medicine. See how research that begins to touch on true human potential is treated, Zion said. Scientists exploring these fields have their careers sabotaged, their funding cut, their work rejected by respectable journals, not through direct conspiracy, but through an academic system that rewards conformity and punishes radical innovation. Arthur was beginning to feel overwhelmed. If all this is true, if there really is this systematic suppression, why are you telling me? What can one person do against such massive systems? Because the system only works while people remain unconscious of it, Zion replied, his mental voice carrying a note of hope. When individuals begin awakening to their true potential, when they begin vibrating at a higher frequency of consciousness, they naturally become immune to low-vibration programming. How does that work? Arthur asked. Let me show you, Zion said. With another gesture, the energy around Arthur shifted again. Suddenly, he could feel a kind of inner glow, a source of energy that seemed completely independent of external circumstances. Feel this energy, Zion instructed. This is your natural source of power, creativity, and well-being. When you're connected to it, as you are now, how do you feel about the problems that normally worry you? Arthur focused on the sensation and realized something extraordinary. The financial fears that normally kept him awake at night seemed trivial and easily solvable. The loneliness that had become his constant companion since Eleanor's death seemed to have transformed into a peaceful form of creative solitude. Even political and social issues that normally left him irritated or hopeless seemed like interesting challenges with potential solutions. It's as if all the problems still exist, but I can see them from a completely different perspective, Arthur said, amazed. Exactly, Zion confirmed. When you're vibrating at a higher frequency, problems that seemed overwhelming become opportunities. Fears that seem justified reveal themselves as illusory, and you naturally begin creating solutions instead of just reacting to problems. But why is this a threat to the systems you mentioned? Arthur asked. Because people operating from this frequency can't be easily manipulated through fear, Zion explained. They don't buy products that promise to make them feel adequate. They don't vote based on fear of enemies. They don't accept jobs they hate just for financial security. They begin creating their own solutions, their own communities, their own ways of living. Arthur could see the logic in that. If he felt constantly connected to the energy he was experiencing now, many of the things that normally motivated him, mainly fear and insecurity, simply wouldn't have power over him. So, what's the next step? Arthur asked. If I accept that all this is true, what do I do with this information? First, you learn to maintain this connection to your internal energy source, even when I'm not here to facilitate it, Zion replied. Second, you begin sharing this perspective with other people who are ready to hear it. And third, you live as an example of what's possible when a human being is operating at their true potential. That seems immense, Arthur said, feeling small before the magnitude of what Zion was suggesting. It doesn't have to be, Zion assured him. Changes in consciousness happen one person at a time. You don't need to save the entire world. You just need to fully awaken to who you really are and live from that truth. The effect spreads naturally. Arthur felt something stirring deep within him, a mixture of hope, purpose, and determination he hadn't felt in years. How do I do this? How do I maintain this connection? That, Zion said with what Arthur interpreted as a smile in his mental voice, is what we'll explore together. But first, you need to make a conscious choice to commit to this path, knowing there's no going back. Once you fully awaken, you can't pretend anymore that you don't know. Arthur looked around the clearing at the extraordinary plants, at the energy line still visible, connecting all things at his own hand, still emanating a soft luminosity. He thought about how he felt in this moment versus how he had felt in the recent months of his life. There really wasn't a choice to make. The life he had been living wasn't life at all. I choose to awaken, he said aloud, and felt the words resonate through his entire being. What happened next would forever change not just how Arthur saw the world, but how he saw himself and his role in the great transformation that was beginning. The moment Arthur spoke those words, I choose to awaken, the energy around the clearing changed dramatically. The light emanating from the exotic plants intensified, and Arthur felt as if some kind of energetic portal had opened within his own chest. It was as if a part of himself that had been asleep for decades was finally awakening. Now begins your true education, Zion said, his form becoming even more solid and defined. What I'm about to share with you are truths your species knew intimately in the past, but which were systematically erased from your collective memory. Zion gestured, and the energy window expanded, now showing images of ancient civilizations, not the limited versions Arthur knew from history books, but something far more magnificent and sophisticated. Your ancestral civilizations understood that each human being is essentially an individualized aspect of universal creative consciousness, Zion began. You are not victims of random circumstances. You are active co-creators of your reality, through your thoughts, emotions, and intentions. Arthur watched images of people in ancient civilizations apparently manifesting abundance, healing each other through directed energy, and communicating telepathically across vast distances. Did this really happen? Arthur asked, fascinated. Not only did it happen, it's still happening, Zion replied. But only among those who have recovered the knowledge of how to access these capabilities. The difference is that before this was common knowledge. Now, it's considered supernatural or impossible. Why was this knowledge lost? Arthur asked. It wasn't lost. It was suppressed. Zion corrected. Because people who know how to create abundance cannot be controlled through manufactured scarcity. People who know how to heal themselves cannot be controlled through fear of disease. People who know how to connect directly with universal wisdom cannot be controlled through external authorities. The images changed, showing the gradual transition from societies based on individual empowerment to societies based on dependence on external systems. Observe how gradually power was centralized, Zion explained. Healing knowledge was monopolized by a medical class. Spiritual knowledge was monopolized by religious institutions. Knowledge about prosperity was monopolized by financial systems. Knowledge about governance was monopolized by political elites. Arthur saw how over centuries individuals were gradually discouraged from trusting their own inner capabilities and taught to seek authority, validation, and solutions from external sources. But why did people accept this? Arthur asked. Why did they give up their power? Because it was presented as progress, Zion replied, as specialization, efficiency, safety, and because those who tried to maintain ancient knowledge were systematically persecuted, ridiculed, or eliminated. The images now showed historical periods where people with knowledge of natural human capabilities were labeled as witches, heretics, or mentally unstable. So, for generations, your species was conditioned to believe you are small, limited, dependent on external systems for survival, healing, prosperity, and even for knowing what to think about reality, Zion continued. But this is changing now, Arthur asked, feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension. Yes, and that's why I'm here, Zion said. Your species is approaching a moment of collective awakening. More and more people are beginning to question systems, to feel there's something more to life than they were taught, to experience capabilities they can't explain through conventional science. Is that why I've been feeling so dissatisfied these past months? Arthur asked. Yes. You're among those who are naturally beginning to awaken, Zion confirmed. Your soul, is literally rejecting low-vibration programming because you're evolving beyond it. Zion made another gesture, and Arthur felt an even greater expansion of his consciousness. Suddenly, he could perceive not just the energy around the clearing, but energy extending far beyond, connecting him to people around the world who are going through similar awakenings. Feel this, Zion instructed. You're not alone in this process. There are millions of people around the planet experiencing the same awakening you are. Many don't even know how to name what's happening, but they all sense that profound changes are coming. Arthur could actually feel it, like a network of light connecting hearts and minds across the planet. It was extraordinarily comforting to know he wasn't going through this alone. What's my role in all this? Arthur asked. What am I expected to do? First, you learn to live as a fully awakened human being, Zion explained. This means learning to maintain your connection to your inner source of energy, wisdom, and creativity, regardless of external circumstances. How do I do that? Through simple practices that reconnect you with your true power, Zion replied. Daily meditation to quiet external mental programming. Time in nature to remember your connection to living systems. Active gratitude to keep your vibration high. Creative visualization to practice conscious manifestation. The images in the energy window now showed people doing exactly these practices and living extraordinarily abundant, healthy, and fulfilling lives. Second, you begin actively questioning all programming you receive, Zion continued. When you watch news, ask, does this information elevate me or diminish me? Does it empower me or make me feel helpless? When making financial decisions, ask, am I acting from fear of scarcity or from trust in abundance? When interacting with medical systems, ask, does this support my natural healing capacity or make me more dependent? Arthur began to understand. So, it's about recovering personal discernment instead of automatically accepting what external authorities say. Exactly. You become your own guru, your own doctor, your own financial advisor. Not in the sense of rejecting all external help, but in the sense of using your inner wisdom as the primary filter for all information, Zion explained. And third, Arthur asked. Third, you live as an example, Zion said. When you're consistently vibrating at a high frequency, when you're naturally manifesting health, abundance, and joy, when you're navigating challenges with creativity instead of fear, you become a living demonstration of what's possible for other human beings. That doesn't sound like evangelizing. No, Zion assured him. You don't need to convince anyone of anything. You simply live your truth. Those who are ready to awaken will be naturally attracted to your energy and will ask questions. Those who aren't ready will simply see you as a lucky or successful person, and that's perfect too. Arthur felt a wave of relief. So, I don't need to become some kind of preacher or activist. Only if that emerges naturally from your joy, Zion replied. Real awakening is never forced or militant. It's radiated through being, not imposed through action. But what about the systems you mentioned? How do they change if people like me just live differently? When enough people stop feeding fear-based systems, those systems naturally transform or dissolve, Zion explained. Systems only exist because people participate in them. When people evolve beyond the need for these systems, they become irrelevant. And this can really happen. It's already happening, Zion said. And the images now showed communities around the world that had created alternative systems based on cooperation instead of competition, abundance instead of scarcity, holistic healing instead of just treating symptoms. You're being invited to be part of this transformation, Zion continued. Not as a soldier in a war, but as a gardener, planting seeds of a new way of living. Arthur felt a wave of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Finally, his life had meaning again. Not just personal meaning, but meaning in relation to something much larger than himself. When do I start? He asked. You already have, Zion replied warmly. The awakening began the moment you made the conscious choice. Now, it's about integrating this new understanding into your daily life. But Arthur was about to discover that integrating spiritual awakening into everyday life would be both simpler and more challenging than he had ever imagined. The days following Arthur's encounter with Zion were for him like learning to live in a completely new world while still inhabiting the old one. Zion didn't disappear immediately after his revelations. Instead, he established what he called a gradual integration period. Regular meetings in the clearing, where Arthur could ask questions, practice the abilities he was developing, and receive guidance on navigating his transformation. The first change Arthur noticed was in his relationship with fear. Issues that previously kept him awake at night, financial worries, health problems, loneliness, didn't disappear completely, but changed in quality. It was as if he could observe them from a higher perspective, seeing them as temporary challenges instead of permanent and overwhelming realities. Fear is just information, Zion explained during one of their meetings. It signals where your attention needs to go, but it doesn't need to dominate your emotional response. When you're connected to your inner source, you can approach any challenge with creativity instead of panic. Arthur began experiencing this directly. When he received an unexpectedly high medical bill from some tests he'd had done, his first reaction wasn't the familiar despair, but calm curiosity about how he could resolve the situation. Within hours, he had thought of 3 different solutions that wouldn't have occurred to him before, including negotiating a payment plan and discovering he qualified for a discount he didn't know about. The second change was in his perception of abundance. Arthur began noticing opportunities and resources that had always been present, but which he simply hadn't seen before. A neighbor casually mentioned needing help with some carpentry work Arthur could easily do. An old tool in the barn, which he'd considered useless, turned out to be valuable to a collector. Small synchronicities began accumulating in ways that seemed almost magical. You're not creating these opportunities out of nothing, Zion explained. They always existed. But when you were operating from a scarcity mindset, your attention was focused only on problems and limitations. Now you're tuned to a frequency where opportunities become visible. Even more impressive were the changes in his physical health. The chronic joint problems that had bothered him for years practically disappeared. His energy increased significantly, and he found himself waking up naturally earlier, feeling rested with fewer hours of sleep. Even his posture improved. He caught himself walking more upright with more confidence. The body always reflects the state of consciousness, Zion observed when Arthur mentioned these changes. When you carry fear, stress, and despair, the body contracts and develops tensions that eventually manifest as physical pain. When you operate from love, trust, and purpose, the body naturally relaxes and heals. But perhaps the most profound transformation was in how Arthur related to other people. Before, social interactions often left him drained or irritated. Now he found himself genuinely curious about people, able to see beyond their superficial personalities to something deeper and more authentic. During a trip to town, Arthur noticed that the grocery store cashier, who normally seemed grumpy and impatient, had incredibly kind eyes and a natural smile when he greeted her with genuine attention. A neighbor he had always considered annoyingly chatty turned out to be lonely and seeking real human connection. When you're vibrating at a higher frequency, you automatically meet and awaken that same frequency in others, Zion explained. People respond to your authentic energy, even if they don't consciously understand what's happening. Arthur began experiencing small interpersonal miracles. Conversations that would normally be superficial became deep and meaningful. People began opening up to him in surprising ways, sharing real concerns, and seeking his opinion on important issues in their lives. One of the most challenging aspects of the transformation was learning to navigate relationships with people who still operated primarily from fear and negativity. Arthur discovered that some conversations that had once been natural now felt heavy and draining. That's normal, Zion assured him. You don't need to judge people who are at a different frequency, but you also don't need to force yourself to remain in energies that no longer serve your growth. Learn to set loving, energetic boundaries. Arthur practiced this with his brother-in-law, who had a habit of calling regularly to complain about politics and vent about financial problems. Instead of avoiding the calls or feeling obligated to absorb all the negativity, Arthur learned to listen with compassion for limited periods, then gently redirect the conversation to more positive aspects or find natural reasons to end it. One of the most surprising discoveries was how his creativity flourished. Arthur had thought of himself as a practical, not particularly creative person for most of his life. But now he found himself having ideas for projects he never would have considered before. From innovative designs to improve the property to ideas for small businesses that could serve his community. Creativity is a natural function of expanded consciousness, Zion explained. When you're no longer spending mental energy on worry and fear, that energy becomes available for inspiration and innovation. Arthur started a garden project that incorporated some of the energetic principles he had learned from Zion. Not only did the plants thrive exceptionally, but neighbors began commenting on how they felt calmer and more energized when visiting his property. Perhaps most importantly, Arthur developed what Zion called intuitive navigation, the ability to make decisions based on inner wisdom rather than just external logic. This began with small things: choosing which route to take to town, deciding when to call someone, instinctively knowing when it was time to rest versus when it was time to act. Gradually, this ability expanded to bigger decisions. Arthur found himself making choices about finances, relationships, and time use that didn't make complete logical sense on the surface, but invariably resulted in unexpected positive outcomes. Your intuition is your connection to universal intelligence, Zion explained. It has access to information your rational mind can't process. Energetic patterns, future possibilities, connections between events that aren't obvious on the surface. But the deepest aspect of the transformation was the emergence of what Arthur could only describe as genuine inner peace. Not the absence of challenges or problems, but a basic sense that he was okay, that he was exactly where he needed to be, that he could trust the natural unfolding of his life. That's the difference between living from ego versus living from soul, Zion observed. The ego is always worried, always trying to control, always comparing and judging. The soul knows its connection to the whole and can relax in the trust that everything is unfolding perfectly, even when it doesn't seem that way on the surface. This didn't mean Arthur became passive or indifferent. On the contrary, he found himself more motivated and effective than he had been in years, but his action now came from inspiration and joy instead of fear and compulsion. After several weeks of this gradual transformation process, Arthur realized he was living a fundamentally different life. Not just in external circumstances, though those had improved too, but in basic quality of experience. It was as if he had awakened from a long, heavy dream and discovered that life could be naturally joyful, abundant, and meaningful. This is just the beginning, Zion told him during one of their last regular meetings. What you've experienced so far are just the basic capabilities of a human being functioning at their natural potential. There's much more to explore as you continue to awaken. Arthur was about to discover exactly how deep this awakening could go and how his personal transformation connected to something much larger happening on the planet. 3 months after his first encounter with Zion, Arthur found himself in a position he never could have imagined. His life had transformed so profoundly that sometimes he wondered if he was living on the same planet he had inhabited before. During his last formal meeting in the clearing, Zion had given Arthur what he called graduation to the next phase of his awakening. You no longer need an external teacher, Zion had explained. Your connection to inner wisdom is strong enough to guide you from here forward. My role now is simply to be available when you need clarification on specific issues. Arthur had felt a mixture of pride and apprehension at this transition. On one hand, it was extraordinary to realize how far he had come. On the other, the prospect of navigating this new world of expanded possibilities alone sometimes seemed overwhelming. But as the days passed, Arthur discovered that his intuition really had become a reliable guide. He could sense when he was aligned with his highest path versus when he was being pulled back into old patterns. It was like having an internal compass that always pointed toward the direction of greatest growth and contribution. The changes in his external life had been remarkable. Financially, he hadn't become wealthy in the conventional sense, but had developed natural prosperity through multiple small opportunities that materialized organically. His property had become more productive. He had started a small, sustainable agriculture consulting business and had made some intuitive investments that proved surprisingly profitable. More importantly, Arthur had completely lost the financial anxiety that had tormented him for years. Even when facing unexpected expenses, he trusted that solutions would appear, and invariably they did. His physical health continued improving in ways that defied his age. Doctors commented on his excellent test results and asked what exercise and diet regimen he was following. Arthur always smiled and said he had simply started living more naturally. But perhaps the most significant change was in how he saw his role in the world. Before, Arthur had felt irrelevant, as if his life didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Now he could clearly sense how his energy and actions created ripples of positive influence that extended far beyond what he could see directly. People began seeking him out naturally for advice. Neighbors who had barely talked to him before began showing up at his property, apparently just to visit, but inevitably ended up sharing deep concerns and leaving with a more hopeful perspective on their challenges. Arthur never preached or tried to convince anyone of his new perspectives. He simply listened with genuine attention and occasionally shared insights that emerged naturally from conversation. But something about his presence seemed to awaken people's inner wisdom. "You're like a radio station broadcasting on a frequency of possibility," a friend had commented recently. "Even when you're not saying anything specific, people feel more hopeful after spending time with you." This had made Arthur think about what Zion had said about awakened people being living demonstrations of human potential. He was beginning to understand that social transformation happened not through persuasion or aggressive activism, but through people living authentic examples of expanded possibilities. There were still moments of doubt and questioning. Sometimes Arthur wondered if his entire experience had been some kind of elaborate psychological episode, if he had simply emerged from a deep depression and attributed the improvement to fantastic causes. But whenever these doubts arose, he looked at the tangible physical evidence. The exotic plant still growing in the clearing, the abilities he had developed, the measurable results in his life. Even more convincing was the fact that others were noticing changes in him that couldn't be explained by normal psychological improvement. His daughter Sarah had commented during a recent visit that he seemed more himself than he'd been in years, but also different in a way I can't explain. Arthur had also begun noticing other people who seemed to be going through similar awakenings. There was a quality of energy, a depth in their eyes, a calm presence he could recognize in others. Some were people he'd known for years but who seemed to have changed recently. Others were strangers he encountered occasionally and with whom he felt immediately connected. This made him think about what Zion had said about a collective awakening happening around the planet. Arthur began wondering how many people were going through similar transformations and how this might affect the world in coming decades. One of the questions that intrigued him most was about technology's role in this transformation. Zion had suggested that natural human capabilities had been suppressed in favor of dependence on external systems. But Arthur could see that technology was also connecting people around the world in ways that could facilitate collective awakening. He had begun researching online and found communities of people exploring concepts similar to what he was learning. There were scientists studying consciousness, doctors exploring energy medicine, educators developing pedagogies based on integral human potential. Maybe Arthur thought the same technology that was used to control and distract can also be used to awaken and connect. Another persistent question was about timing. Why now? Why was his species going through this transformation at this particular moment in history? Zion had mentioned it was a crucial moment in human evolution. But Arthur wondered about the specific details. He had begun noticing that many of the crises dominating the news, climate change, economic instability, political polarization, could be symptoms of old systems no longer working as human consciousness evolved. Perhaps the apparent intensification of global problems was actually a sign that humanity was being forced to find solutions from a higher level of consciousness. This led him to question his own role in this larger transformation. Arthur knew he had changed profoundly and could see how his change was affecting people around him, but he wondered if there was something more specific he should be doing to contribute to the collective awakening. When he expressed this concern to Zion during one of their occasional communications, the response was characteristically simple. Keep being who you've become. The rest will unfold naturally. Arthur was beginning to understand that perhaps the most important contribution he could make was simply to live with complete integrity from his new understanding. Not forcing anything, not trying to save anyone, just radiating authenticity and allowing others to be drawn to that energy if they were ready. As he reflected on his journey, Arthur felt profound gratitude, not just for his own transformation, but for being part of something much larger. He could sense he was living during an extraordinary historical moment, a time when the human species itself was evolving toward a higher expression of its potential, and he knew with a certainty that came from the deepest part of his being that this was only the beginning. Arthur's story shows us something extraordinary, that each of us carries capabilities and potential far beyond what we've been taught to believe. How many times have you felt just like Arthur felt, that something was fundamentally wrong with the world, that people are living far below their true potential? Maybe just as Arthur discovered, you too have deep intuitions that you dismiss as illogical. Maybe you also feel there's something more to life than just working, paying bills, and constantly worrying. Maybe you've also noticed that the media and systems around us seem to keep people in a state of fear and dependency. Arthur found answers in the woods behind his house, but you can find yours right where you are now. Because awakening to our true potential doesn't depend on encounters with beings from other worlds. It depends on reconnecting with the wisdom and power that already exists within you. Though it's comforting to know that there are guides and evolved beings available to help us in this awakening when we're open to receiving that guidance, even if unconsciously much of the time. If this transformation journey touched your heart, leave a comment. What signs of awakening have you noticed in your own life? Have you had moments where you felt you were capable of much more than you believed possible? And tell me, what would you do differently in your life if you knew with absolute certainty that you possess extraordinary capabilities waiting to be rediscovered? This story is based on a real encounter, but has been transformed into narrative with adjustments and dramatic elements to create a more engaging and inspiring experience. Remember, you are not small, limited, or dependent. You are an extraordinary being temporarily forgotten of your own greatness. And it's time to awaken.